Hey everyone! Thank you so much for everyone who made the time to join us tonight. My name is Daniela and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of the Boulder Alt Protein Project. So we are a student-run organization at the University of Colorado Boulder. And we're also an initiative of the Good Food Institute, which is a global philanthropy-driven nonprofit organization. And our primary goal at the Boulder Alt Protein Project is to get students involved in alternative proteins. And to us, alternative proteins means primarily plant-based meats, fermentation-based meats, and cultivated meat, but also some other animal product alternatives. So yeah, here on this call, we have our president, Varsha, Alexis, our vice president, Mia, our chief technology officer. And yeah, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen just so Jeremiah will be able to get on here. But in the meantime, I'm gonna introduce him. So Jeremiah Johnston is going to be joining us tonight to talk about New Harvest's latest grant and fellowship opportunities. So I'm going to introduce Jeremiah. He earned his bachelor's in biochemistry and molecular biology from Gettysburg College and received his master's in molecular biophysics and biochemistry from Yale. Prior to working for New Harvest, he taught a summer biomedical engineering lab course for high school students. Jeremiah is passionate about science communication and loves engaging in research that has a positive impact on the world. As New Harvest's current research program director, Jeremiah has a lot of information to share with us about how their fellowship and research program works. I'm also going to explain a little bit about how this webinar format will go. So Jeremiah will be speaking for about 40 minutes. And if you think of a question that you want to ask anytime, please type it in the Q&A box and Jeremiah will answer it at the end of the event. If you want to type a comment, thought, or reaction anytime during the event, feel free to just use the chat box to do so. After Jeremiah is done answering questions, he offered to stay late to talk to any students who have specific research questions or project ideas. So if you want to talk to him personally at the end of the event, just mention it in the chat and we will make sure to turn on your webcam and microphone capabilities. All right, so now I'm going to hand it off to Jeremiah. I don't know if you want to start your slides and start your screen share.
Sure, I'll just get that set up. But first off, thank you, Daniela, and thank you to the entire Boulder Alt Protein Project for inviting me today. I think as I was saying to some of the executives here, we were talking about doing this back in February when the world was a very different place. Here we are today. So of course, welcome to all of those of you who are in attendance. I'm personally in the East Coast time zone right now, so if there's anyone else there, I know one person's from Cornell right now, so welcome to the evening. But welcome to everyone. Of course, if you are watching this later, welcome now from the past into the future, I guess I'll say. Yeah, thank you, another person from Cornell. So this talk is going to be something that I try and avoid doing when I give talks, but it is important to give, and that is something that's purely information-based. And if you've seen me speak before, for instance, at UC Davis, it'll be roughly the same talk with a few minor tweaks. This is roughly the third time I've given it in the past week and a half or so. So I think I know all of the orders of things. If I trip up on a few words, just know that's to be expected, perhaps. I'm just going to go and quickly share my screen. Now, this talk will also assume that you have a basic idea of what cellular agriculture is. And all you really need to know for that, of course, is that it is growing meat that people would be consuming from cell culture as opposed to harvesting it from an animal. Can everyone see my slides here? Kind of hard to tell because I know people have turned their cameras off, but I believe it's good. So without any further ado, I guess I'll start. Oh, thank you. Thank you. All right, so I decided to call this talk kind of creating the field of cellular agriculture, because if you get nothing else out of this, what I want you to feel, especially if you're at a student level, whatever level you might be at, undergraduate, graduate, or even considering postdocs perhaps, I want you to feel empowered to make a difference in creating this field together. because one of the great joys of this work truly has been that, it really is about creating not just a new technology, but a new field of scientific inquiry. And as someone who's in charge of figuring out, which research projects we fund, it's a delight pretty much every day to be learning about new things people are doing and, what they are wanting to contribute to this. So to that end, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is how you can get involved with New Harvest, some of the funding opportunities we have. But first, I wanted to give a little bit of a background as to why New Harvest exists as an organization and how we kind of see the field going, both as a nonprofit within it, but also from a scientific perspective. So as soon as I get my cursor in the right place, here we go. So to that end, again, I just want to talk a little bit about what New Harvest sees themselves doing in this, and I've just got a few slides on that. But essentially, like I was saying, cellular agriculture is this technology, perhaps, where you can grow meat from cell culture as opposed to having to take it from an animal. And we see that being beneficial for two reasons. One is that it is generally considered to be more ethical, as I'm sure is not too hard to dispute. But we also see it as being a more sustainable option to feed the planet than we are currently doing with some of the factory farming going on, at least in North America and Europe and other places across the world. And to get there, we really see this as not just one institution doing this, not just one group of students doing this, not just even one country doing this, but really the whole world. And the way that we kind of encompass the world in our communications about that is by talking about something called the cellular agriculture ecosystem. As a student, you fall into that. And again, I'll be talking a little bit more about how you can get involved with that as we go through the talk. But that's generally what we're about doing, is that we really want to see this be built globally across the world in many different institutions, many different people coming in to share their expertise and skills. And that's because, like I was just saying, the scientific advancements, the research we fund is one thing, but of course the other arm of that is, of course, the technical leaders who are going to be doing that research and creating those discoveries and making those technological advancements. Again, I'll be talking a little bit more about that as we go through, but just keep that in mind as that happens. Because ultimately, in the end, like I was saying before, feeling empowered is the idea that I want you to leave this talk with. And that's really where you come in, either as someone doing both scientific advancement or as a future technical leader in the field. So, get excited. You are welcome here, and we want to have you contributing. But speaking of, all of this kind of together, in a broader sense, why is New Harvest work needed? And before I answer that question, there's kind of just a few things I want to share first. First off, we recognize that one thing that is going to be pivotal for creating this ecosystem of research, of interested people in industry, and that sort of thing, is of course public academic research. That's really what New Harvest stands for. And of course, building that research community is super important to us as well. And so the way that we kind of break down our funding goals, I should note that New Harvest, does fund research, but we are completely donor funded. So we still have to do some fundraising in order to raise money to fund research. But, we kind of see our job in all of this as both being a funder, but also a communicator, as well as a network hub for people who want to get involved with cell ag. So that's why I've been invited here today to speak to all of you. That's why I'm invited to speak at various other places, to kind of get the word out about what New Harvest is trying to do and what future we're trying to help create. But to answer that question of why our work is actually needed and why others like us are needed in this field, requires recognizing that the cell ag funding landscape is quite unique. And that's why, nonprofits like New Harvest, like the Good Food Institute exist. I'll talk about that right about now. So if you think of cell ag as a future biotechnology, which is another way of kind of saying it, it's good to compare it to what the funding landscape looks like for other biotechs. And so typically what you have is this sort of bimodal distribution, if you will, of funding dollars on the y-axis and where the research is happening sort of on the x-axis there. And generally, early stage research is conducted through public funding. So these are the government grants from various scientific institutions. In the US, those are like the NSF, the NIH. And that's where that early stage research is occurring. So those things that can't necessarily be technologically applicable, but are part of the process of understanding the problem before you can then begin to take that fundamental knowledge and turn it into something like a technology. And that's where that product demonstration scale-up is. This is the other sort of funding pool, you could say. And that is mostly handled by, private interests, so industry, we sometimes say, I guess, who can get like venture capitalist funding, as well as other funding from certain philanthropists who are more interested in like the technological application, to then demonstrate that this product can exist and then scale it up. And so where a lot of funding is focused in classic biotech is the gap in the middle, which is sometimes known as the valley of death. And that's where you're going from early stage research to product demonstration and scale up at this translational research stage. So that's normally where funding would be for this. But what makes cell ag rather unique is you'll see there is a huge interest in private funding, but not so much of an interest in public funding. Such that we kind of call this whole area of early stage research a funding gap. So early stage research, again, being research that is all about asking the basic questions about this technology that you're trying to create. In engineering design, the first thing is always understanding the problem. So this is where we're trying to understand the different questions. And I'll talk about more about what some of those are, a little bit more further on my presentation. But like I was saying before I introduced all of this about the funding landscape, this is kind of where New Harvest and the Good Food Institute step in to sort of fill that funding gap, if you will. So our ecosystem building is less about focusing on traditionally funded areas of cell ag, which is the private side, and more about funding public open access research to answer really fundamental questions about cell ag as a field of scientific inquiry. So that's why we exist, which is great because I like having a job. But the eventual goal, of course, is that we do enough good work to do public funding that government agencies start taking notice and start stepping in to help fill that funding gap as well. UC Davis just got a big grant, for instance, from the NSF to look at cellular agriculture. So we're quite excited for them and congratulate them that way. So we think this is where the tide is going, but regardless. So to this end, in the few years that New Harvest has been funding research, going back to about 2015, I believe is when the fellowship program started, is that in addition to there being this kind of unequal distribution of funding from public and private, one of the reasons why cell ag has a really hard time getting a hold of some of that public money is because cell ag as a field of inquiry exists in a funding gap. So I've got this little Venn diagram here where there is certainly money to research food as a science, food science is a thing. And there's certainly money to research, medical technologies and biomedical engineering, but cell ag kind of falls between those two. And so it's a little hard to take advantage of some of those publicly available funds. So that's kind of, if cell ag has two big funding issues, one is, of course, there's lack of public funding in general for it, but also that it's not easily categorizable by scientific institutions or scientific funding institutions, I should say. So again, that's where we kind of come in. And we're of the opinion, and I guess I would say ethical stance, that because a lot of the research dollars are in the private sector, a lot of the information that could be used to help understand the problem and to really make this a technology that could be implemented, is all held up in terms of trade secrets and, private interests and, things where there is a very good reason not to share your research because you're trying to innovate in a competitive way. And again, this is not a slight towards that, but just a realization that a lot of what we would consider fundamental questions is happening in the private sector because it's not really happening in the public sector. And finally, and really where New Harvest wants to step in, and we hope we're doing this with the research that we are funding, is if you have a lot of research dollars focused in private industry, that means a lot of the information that could be used to spread cell ag throughout the world, really, is also not readily available. And so that is something that we think limits the impact of cell ag on a global scale. And we've got some ways of trying to get around that as an organization, and I think that will show up a little bit later in my presentation. But kind of like I've been alluding to this whole time, this is where my job, so as someone who decides which projects we fund at New Harvest, and you as people who presumably want to investigate cellular agriculture or see it as a technology that you would like to see implemented in the future. This is where you come in, and this is where we come in to try and really be that a source of funding if you want to get into this field and answer some of those basic questions. And so to that end, I'm just going to kind of keep going and hoping everyone is kind of following along. Okay, I saw another question pop up. I'll read those in a second. But to that end, I just want to say, sort of this is where the presentation switches gears a little bit. And so I talk about my job, and I just mentioned it briefly on the last slide. A lot of what I do as the research program director at New Harvest is I'm reviewing applications for people who want to get involved with cell ag. And I'll talk about the application process as we go forward. I'll talk about how you can get involved if you want to study this. But I kind of want to give you an idea because 9 times out of 10, I'm answering this basic question of what is the kind of research that we fund at New Harvest. And so the first thing I always want to check, and indeed when people submit applications during our regular application cycle, one of the first questions we check is this cellular agriculture? Or is this something that could better be funded by food science sources of money or biomedical engineering sources of money? And so the way that we define cellular agriculture comes from our CEO, Isha Datar, one of her papers, I think it's 2010. I'm trying to remember exactly the year. Terrible that I don't know that exactly. But regardless of which, we define cell ag as research questions involving these 4 different properties. And you see this diagram to the right, which is a sort of schematic of what that looks like as a bioprocess. But we are generally interested in funding research that's based on cells. So either cells that people are sourcing, to create novel sort of products of cell ag. So when I say novel products, it's not just beef, chicken, and pork. It could also be venison, could also be fish, could be a lot of things. We fund research into media. So media being, of course, the food that cells eat when they're in culture. Currently comes from fetal bovine serum, so it's an animal sourced product, and a lot of our research is that we support in media is about creating serum-free versions of that, of course. So things that don't require animals. Scaffolding research, that can be applied for both or many different kinds of cell ag, and that's a very broad category of things. I can talk about that at the end, of course. And also, bioreactor research. So anything that involves how do you put these 3 different components together, the cells, scaffold it's needed, and media to create what you see on the end here, this lovely hamburger. But there's also a 4th category of research that we consider to be cellular agriculture. And I've got it highlighted here as the hamburger, and that's representing other. So really, that's the final end product of research. And so we're very interested in research that looks at all aspects of this bioprocess in general. So for instance, one of the projects that we fund, which we put kind of in the other category, is a food safety project from a student who is interested in looking at what kinds of bacteria might grow on cell ag products as they go through the production process. We're also interested in, different stages around, where you procure your cells, where you procure your scaffold materials, various and sundry things. So that's how we define cellular agriculture. I don't know if that was 100% clear, but this is a great time to ask questions at the end, which is something that I like to talk a lot about. But to kind of give you a snapshot of what our research funding looks like, I just added this slide today, so this is new for people who may have seen this talk before, is this wonderful image that we put together a little bit about, which kind of shows a nice web chart of the different research we fund. And you can see those 5 pillars, cells, scaffold, media, bioreactor, and other. But what I really want you to notice, and this is especially for the students in the crowd, and especially for those who are interested in cellular agriculture and how I define that as a scientific field, is that this is a field of overlaps. There's not really many projects you could argue that are definitively in one or the other, and especially the projects that we fund at New Harvest. And the reason why I want to show the overlaps is kind of the next point that I want to make, and that is a question that I get many, many times when I talk to students who are interested about getting into cellular agriculture is something along the lines of, I studied this, I don't know if it applies. And what I really want to say is because this is both the field that we're looking to create and because it's a field of overlaps, essentially, there's really no specific technical background experience that I expect an applicant to have coming in. I mean, obviously someone who's interested in biology and cellular agriculture is a bit of a requisite. But you'd be surprised at how many different backgrounds and how many different fields of scientific inquiry and engineering design can be incorporated into cellular agriculture. And the great joy of creating a field is you can kind of decide if you are relevant or not. And I don't mean that in a cheeky way per se, but like actually, come with what you have and there is a place for you is what I'm trying to say generally, believe it or not. And that can always be an interesting thing to hear when you're at this stage of your training. So that's one way to answer what we fund. Is everyone still with me? Okay. Okay, good. I'm looking at the time too, so I want to make sure I save time for things at the end. There's a little bit more too. So again, we mandate interdisciplinary collaboration. So research that we have a sense of, being able to contribute to other research projects that we have. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the end. But just like I was saying about this being a field of overlap, it really is a field where collaboration between those different fields is super important. And that's something that we actively encourage our fellows to do. And I've got a slide about that at the end. I'll talk about that way. Additionally, in addition to all the things I had said about, the 4 pillars /5, if we count other as a pillar, one thing that New Harvest really focuses on in research is, this this oxymoron that I say doesn't really mean anything if you think about it too long. But that is that we tend to fund research that is, so-called generally specific. And what I mean by that is we're looking for research that is so fundamental that it can be broadly applied to other categories. And that's a little bit hard to say what I mean by some projects like that. And I'll go on a tangent for a while. But the best way to sum it up beyond that little oxymoron is we're looking for research that is kind of like the rising tide that lifts all boats. So research that can either, eliminate entire fields of inquiry because it is a kind of a quantum leap in innovation or ideas, or research that is, just broadly applicable in that sense. And a great example of that I can talk about a little bit. Finally, and this goes back to our point about building an ecosystem that is global and not just located in one particular region, one particular school, or with one particular group of people. We ask all of our fellows and anyone else who works with us to publish the research, hopefully in an open access journal, or at the very least to make that research openly available. This is why we tend to fund research that again is more fundamental, less something that might be hidden in a trade secret or something like that in the future. We want the people doing research for us to share it with the world and for people to access it and make it their own. That's again a very specific New Harvest stance on things, but it's something that I stand by and something that we try and make sure our fellows are compliant with when we do this research together. So that's kind of the initial run. I know that was a lot all at once, so thank you for your attention and your patience. The next bit is going to be more specifically on the research awards, grants, if you will, that we support. It's going to be a lot of information. Some of it may be relevant to you. I'll try and go through everything roughly equally, but hopefully we'll get a sense of that here. And I'm liking the questions coming in, but I will stick to my presentation for now. We will get to them. So this is one that you can screenshot now if you're watching from home, where this is just kind of the basic overview of all of our funding opportunities. But the information that I want you to pay attention to here, more than the other bullet points, because I go into those in more detail later, is that we are now switching to one application cycle per year for all applications. It is true that that does perhaps limit, some people from applying this year versus next, but it's something we're going to try. We're a small organization, so we're going to see how it goes this year. But regardless of any future implementations of that, or iterations, I should say, the next due date is January 15th. So if you want to put together a proposal for any of these awards, it's not too late. You've got some time. We can talk tonight after my presentation is done, or feel free to email me. It might take me about a week to get back, but I do read them as I get them. But again, as this mentions, we've got three options for research funding currently: the fellowship grant, the seed grant, and the dissertation award. And I think I'll just go into them now so we can kind of just keep moving through things. So fellowship grant is a 3-year award, or at least up to 3 years, I should say. The average award size for that is $120,000 US dispersed every 6 months over that paid period. And this is really intended for graduate students, specifically those pursuing a PhD. However, master's students have applied and gotten this in the past. We also, I would say, equally encourage postdocs to apply for this, although they generally only propose 18-month as opposed to 3-year awards. And that's because this is a much more intensive, much more network-focused funding opportunity. I think before I really get into any of this, one thing I want to emphasize is, don't think of New Harvest just as a blank check. We really are here to build a relationship with all of you who might be interested in applying, and certainly all of the fellows that we currently have and other researchers that we fund. So because of that, that's why the application process for this is a bit hairier, and I'll try and go through this quickly. But the idea is that for this grant, you do need an advisor, someone to prepare this application with. I can generally tell when someone hasn't done that, so please do that. And I also encourage you to come and talk to me if you'd like to clarify your project a bit more. That's something that I'll happily do, because I get to hear about what people are thinking of doing and let you know more about what I just talked about with the research we tend to fund. But there are 4 steps to this process. There's an eligibility round, again, where it's sort of just a check of whether you are eligible for our funding or not, as in, are you a cell ag project or something else? Then the project goes through an independent review stage. And so that is when we send your project out to scholars, so other professors, postdocs perhaps, who then review the application, give feedback on it. I review that, and then I send that back to you for the next stage, which is the revision process, where you're given the chance to then add those changes or discuss why you didn't add them, which is also an interesting thing too. And then I interview both you as the applicant and your PI as well to kind of make sure that you understand some of our policies as a New Harvest Fellow. And then a few weeks after that, we make the decision on whether you're funded or not. And if you don't get funded, we do encourage people to apply again generally. So that's always something you can do. But the bottom line is that about 4 months after you submit is when we let you know if you got the award or not. So it is a longer process, certainly, but something that we like to be careful in because this is a relationship we're building for 3 years or so. So that's important to us, and we recognize it's important to give everyone a fair shake as it too. There are 3 criteria for how we fund, and I'll just go through these briefly because I got about 10 minutes left. As we look at your budget, so if you propose a less expensive budget, it generally increases your chances of being funded because the more money you're able to raise on your own or provide from the get-go, the more people we can fund, essentially. But that being said, the average budget people propose, because some important thing about this application is that you do propose your own budget, and I can talk more about that in the Q&A. Is about $40,000, give or take US dollars. So, it kind of ranges over a scale, but happy to talk more about that if people are curious. Your scientific impact. So the way that I rate this is both the novelty of your research as well as how many overlaps currently exist with other fellows. What I mean by that is a huge thing that we want to do, and it kind of feeds into the community impact, which is the next criteria, is because the fellowship grant is more of a network of people and more of a community of researchers. We want to make sure that the research you are doing can be supported by other members of the community, but also that you in turn can support other members of our research community. So I'm actively looking at how much overlap there is between you and other fellows and other people in the application pool. And finally, the community impact is another thing I just want to talk about briefly, and that is, again, we're looking for people who don't just want to do research, but also want to be and see themselves and feel empowered as future leaders in this field. And so this year, we're going to have a personal statement about that in the application. It's kind of the squishiest, least quantitative, but we try and do have a rubric that we follow for this. But those are kind of the 3 big things that go into whether we decide to fund or not. And it's always an interesting question by the end of the day. Okay, so that was that. Again, that's more for graduate students, for postdocs, for master's students. Seed grant, however, and this might be more relevant for some of you in the audience, is generally for undergraduates. Again, some master's students do apply to this, especially if they're like a 1-year program. But it was originally created with the idea of summer research projects or like senior capstone projects in mind. And because of that, hopefully that makes the timeline make a little more sense. So 3 to 6 months is the time we estimate this being, and you can propose up to $5,000 US for it. And it's actually very similar in application to the fellowship program. As a matter of fact, some of the paperwork we send out is almost exactly the same. That is, you need an advisor, you write a proposal, and then you talk with me about it. And then what it happens is that goes through a single review round. There's another rubric that we follow, which is, I'll talk about in the decision criteria. One thing you can do, and I encourage people to do this, is, you're always allowed to submit early if you want some feedback on your application. Granted, it is from the perspective of whether New Harvest will fund this project or not, so it might be of limited utility. But, really, when you apply, we want to make sure that it's a useful experience for you, even if we aren't able to fund your project. And so that's why, we want it to be as strong as possible when you submit. Again, the application criteria currently is about 4 months from submission. You'll notice this is the same as the fellowship application. And the reason for that is not particularly interesting. That might change. The reason why, I'll just say briefly for all of these, is that we want to make sure that we have money in our budget to fund everyone for the time that we promise we will fund them. And so after we kind of decide on the big awards, which is the fellowship, then we're able to see how much money we have left in the budget for some of these smaller awards. But really what I'm looking for, in addition to those kind of three things I mentioned, is this seed project in service of degree training? Is this something that is going to help someone in their educational pathway? And really, more than anything else, is this person at this level expressing an understanding of experimental design? And do they have adequate mentorship to get that help? So it's kind of in preparation for maybe making other funded research opportunities in the future. So that's what that's all about. And finally, the newest award, I'll go through this one quickly, is the Dissertation Award. This is a one-time disbursement of $10,000 US, and this is generally for PhD students in their final year, or those who have recently defended, as in the case, for what we're getting around this time for the cycle. How I was saying it this morning when I was talking to someone about this award is, if the fellowship program is about what you want to do, the Dissertation Award is more about what you have done. And another way I like to think about it is, people who apply for this generally found out about cell ag a little too late to focus their PhD on it, but they recognize the potential in the field. They recognize that they want to make a contribution, and their research actually could be applicable. This one has the simplest application process. I say it requires a letter of recommendation and a statement of interest. I can talk a little bit more about that, what that means. But again, this goes through an internal review process. We don't send it out for external review, and we make a decision on it 4 months from submission. And really what we're looking for is people, like I said, who have a keen desire to participate in the community and really do see how their research can contribute to cell ag as a field. So those are the three things that we offer. And hopefully you got that information. Fortunately, it is recorded, and you can always email me to ask for this information and various application packets, as our website says. But that is a brief overview of kind of what we offer. And finally, just in the last few minutes I have here, I got this question, what is the most important project we fund, from a student at a class I was, I guess, teaching in. And I did that annoying thing that speakers sometimes do, where you answer the question as you want to answer it, but not necessarily as the person intended it to be answered. Happy to talk about kind of crazy projects we do fund, in my mind, crazy in a good way. But what I often tell people about, when it comes to the most important project we fund, is really it is the people. Like I was saying in the beginning, we want you to feel empowered, that you can make a difference in this field, that you can be a leader or a pioneer. And that is something that we hold very dearly at New Harvest. And I would say we rate almost equally to the research potential of any project that we do fund. Because we really do invest with you. And we mandate, and we actually, it sounds like a scary word, but we do provide ample opportunities for people to make sure that they are talking with each other. So how that manifests is that the fellows all have a weekly meeting, where it's sort of a miniature journal club of sorts, or lab meeting, I guess as some might say. That's every week. I run those, however many hours they last, every Tuesday. There's an annual meeting as well when we can travel again, where the fellows meet for a week to both build community as well as look at specialized training presentations and things like that. It's kind of just a time to spend time together, not virtually. Seed grantees, this is going to be happening next week for some of our people. There's a monthly meeting with me where they kind of say what's happening in their research. Many of our seed grantees also are in labs of our fellows, so they have that active collaboration there where they're getting that sort of assistance. And the dissertation awardees currently, they also participate in these weekly meetings because their input is great. And we will have them when we have a conference again, give a sort of, or we'll save a lecture time for them so they can talk about their research and really, show kind of the cool things they can contribute to the field. And all of this kind of goes back to this New Harvest axiom that we have, which is it's people that create change, not the projects necessarily. And again, that's why we want you to feel empowered. It's not what you do, it's who you are and what you want to bring and your unique perspective, which is what we're looking for at New Harvest, more than anything, I would say. And to that end, I mean, here are some of the people that we fund. Ted is in the audience, but he's not in this picture. My apologies for that. But here are some of our fellows doing things across the world. And when I say across the world, I actually do mean that, because, again, because I'm kind of running over with time right now. Here's a little map or distribution. It's not 100% updated, but roughly where our projects have been and roughly where they've been in the past. Should be is no surprise that we fund a lot of people in North America, but there's been some great work going on in Australia with CELAG Australia, one of those organizations down there. We have a pretty active partnership, or partnership's not the right word, but we fund fellows at the University of Auckland in Australia, as well as a seed grantee. Plenty of people in the UK doing this work. But one day I would love to see this filled with dots, because what's really cool about this work is, it's a technology, but that technology is often shaped by the unique context in which it is grown. And so that's really an exciting thing about CELAG to see. We don't really have one, or I'd say no one country has a monopoly on it. It's really a global phenomenon at this point. But that's kind of the end of what I have to say. Again, thank you, of course, for your questions, and I believe those will be moderated, so that will be chosen that way. But if anyone has any questions, of course, feel free to leave them in the Q&A box, and defer to our wonderful moderator from CU Boulder, who is going to be fielding some of those for me. So thank you for your attention, especially if you're in my time zone or in another one. It's a little bit later, but we're going to get through this, okay? So thank you all for that.
Yeah, thank you so much for the awesome presentation. That was great. Yeah, so we have a lot of questions in the Q&A. I'll help moderate them. So yeah, the first question, going back to when you're talking about the funding gap that exists for cellular agriculture, why do you think this funding gap exists? And is it like a social perception of the field, or was it simply because it falls outside traditional funding categories?
So that's a really interesting question, I'd say. And I always like to be a person who has data to point to for my answer, but I'll admit this will probably be my opinion and speculations more than anything else, at least when it comes to things that aren't directly science-based. But I think one strength of CELAG is why you might see it funded in such a way, and that strength being that I'd argue conceptually it's pretty simple to think about. And it's not too hard to imagine what might be needed to make it. It's pretty, once you understand, I'd say, some of the basic principles of tissue engineering, the idea that cells have to grow, but they need to grow in 3 dimensions, and they need to grow together in a happy way, and they need to be fed media, and we don't have bodies to grow them in if we're growing them outside of that, so we need a bioreactor to put them in. It's easy to understand the parts, and if people understand the parts, then it's not too hard to imagine what that technology could be. And it's very easy to say, I'd argue, if I want to make a specific impact, like I want to, for instance, address a particular species that's being overfished, perhaps, or, if I want to, if you're particularly strong about cows versus chickens for whatever reason, generally greenhouse gas emission, I would say. It's not too hard to see what that direct application could be, and therefore it's not too hard to convince people that you should fund this specific technology. But I think another thing that happens is people go in with the assumption that, this is something that if, you kind of put enough money at it, it's easy to solve. Plant-based alternative proteins are similar in that way. We understand the problem pretty well. And so it's not too hard to figure out if I simply invest enough money in it, then I can gather enough resources and I can, solve the technology problem pretty well. But I think one of the issues is because again, it's so easy to talk about cell ag, people forget that it is a biological question. And, you know, I used to be a camp counselor, as was said in my intro, and I often told my colleagues that I was glad I was trained as a biologist because that meant that I was used to things not going the way that I planned them to. So biology, of course, is a very slippery field in general. You think you understand it, but it's really hard to know. So I know that was a lot of thoughts at once, but to kind of sum, I'd say, again, there's an assumption that, you know, the amount of resources you can spend in it is proportional to the technological impact you can make, where in fact, especially with anything biological, really investing in asking those basic questions can often lead to a little bit more impact. And that's not always immediately obvious if you're coming from a field outside of biology or any other natural science, I would say, in that sense. So I don't have a 100% answer on that, but that's kind of just my opinion for that, if that makes any sense. So.
Yeah, that definitely does. That you made some really good points about that.
Thank you.
So for the next question, do you work with industry to develop projects or questions that will be funded through No Harvest, or is it just solely working with academics?
Yeah, so I can save myself a lot of breath by answering it quickly. And currently, it is purely through academics. I'm not always satisfied with that as an answer because, you know, as one of our PIs that we work with points out, there's a lot of money in industry that can be used to help, you know, ask some of those basic questions that I, you know, was just emphasizing. The question itself kind of gets into the whole idea about what is open access once a patent is involved in terms of like what's open licensing. And truth be told, we haven't had necessarily the bandwidth to dedicate a nuanced approach at this point. Something that, you know, as we hire more people, I'm hoping I can tackle. But currently, we don't necessarily work with industry. We're not against industry or opposed to industry, but we recognize that there is funding for industry. And, you know, we generally focus more on the academic, more of the fundamental rather than the applied. So currently, at least. So that's kind of how I answer that.
Yeah, makes sense. So the next question is, are there any other organizations like New Harvest across the world?
Of course, and I will probably miss a few because I am one person who is generally forgetful when it comes to important things, unfortunately. Not a great thing for the research director to be saying, but you know, we're all human here. So of course, there's the Good Food Institute, which funds a lot more research than we do at New Harvest. They do both plant-based and cell-based, or I think cultivated, as they say. We do purely cell-based and other projects tangential to that bioprocess. But there's Cell Ag Canada, which, you know, for the person who asked about industry, I know that they tend to have a few more industrial contacts there, I should say. So definitely check out Cell Ag Canada. There's also Cell Ag Australia, which I believe just got some funding recently. So they're trying to start groups out there. I'd say by and large, we're seeing a lot of interest from governments like in the UK who are interested in funding Cell Ag. Canada is interested in it. Singapore just announced a partnership with New Zealand universities, kind of as a co-country / co-institution. Probably better to look up the press release than to have me ramble about it. So in addition to the nonprofits, some governments are receptive to funding this research. And it's really cool to see that's, again, not just in the US, but across the world, I would say. So definitely check out those. There are a few others. And I believe GFI has a whole part of their website dedicated to some of the extra funding in the space. So definitely check them out if you can.
That's really cool to hear about, that there's beginning to be so many different funding avenues across the world.
It's happening, which is an exciting time to be around it, I would say. So definitely.
Yeah. All right. So the next question is still about funding, but the question is, could you comment on the impact on the CELAC funding landscape that you think will like occur with the recent NSF grant that Davis just received?
Yes, I'm going to take a sip of water here, so excuse my swallowing, everyone. So the first thing I'll answer is I'm probably not the best person at New Harvest to answer that question. That'd probably be Isha. But as someone who gets roped into a lot of these conversations, it makes it sound like a negative thing. It really isn't. What I offer right now is my speculative opinion. I do hope that UC Davis getting that award will be a trigger to the NSF that these are projects worth funding. Because another project that often gets submitted on behalf of CELAG are these NSF Emerging Research Center grants. And what's cool about these is that they're multi-institutional, so it's not just one school getting it, but a whole slew of schools getting it. And they're generally across the country. You know, for better or for worse, a lot of New Harvest's North American research is concentrated in one of the earliest labs to be interested in funding it or studying it, and that's you know, David Kaplan at Tufts. And we fund, you know, 4 of our 19 fellows in there, give or take. It's 19 is the current count. It changes every few months, so that's why it's always floating in my head. And of course, you know, UC Davis, and we have Amy Rowett at UCLA, so, you know, California too. But we don't have a lot of funding in some of the rest of the country. And so what I hope is that we'll start seeing, you know, if it's USC Davis getting the money first and some of their collaborators, that will be spread across to other institutions. And hopefully we'll see, you know, multiple places pulled in to really address this. And hopefully that will be a, you know, kind of clarion call, I think is the word, for the rest of the world and the rest of the country to follow. I was joking with Isha, our CEO, the other day that we might need to update that slide because that's been a pretty fundamental one at New Harvest for some time. But, you know, we'll continue to be around. Well, I certainly hope. But there's this joke in New Harvest that our eventual mission is not to have to exist. It's a terrifying thing for me to hear, but also a great thing for me to hear because, you know, if we get a large investment in public funding, I think that will really help the field, of course, grow, and just in general too. It's good to see more investment in research, I would say. So I hope that kind of gets at the answer there. Just my speculations.
Yeah, that was a really good answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the next question kind of comes back to New Harvest and like your funding projects. So how does New Harvest view projects that are not only applicable to cell ag, but also have the potential applicability to conventional biomedical tissue engineering activities?
So I'll answer that one because I saw a few others that looked at that. So one reason why I brought up the training field is I sometimes get asked by people what's the best thing is to study. And this is my weird way of answering this question. So bear with me for a second, everyone. So food is one way you can go, like food studies and things around like, you know, waste product valorization and other such things that you might see in like a food system-y kind of thing. But the other one I suggest to people, if you know they're feeling a little less certain about cell ag, but want to still be in something where they could jump into it, is to do biomedical engineering, because a lot of the questions that are answered in cell ag really will be applicable to biomedical engineering, especially tissue biomedical engineering, I would say. You know, cell ag has a great leg up on that because our tissue that we engineer eventually only has to be alive until you cook it, or preferably, you know, alive until you harvest it, which I guess is take it out of the bioreactor. The biomedical engineering folks have a much harder time, I think, because not only does it have to stay alive and probably be vascularized in that way, but also be non-immunogenic and not, you know, react in a nasty way with people. So we don't often talk about it. in New Harvest, but a lot of the questions that CELAC has to answer are good stepping stones for biomedical applications in the future. And there are many ways to talk about why that is. And there are many things that I would say are unique about CELAG that you don't have to necessarily worry about in biomedical engineering. And but so we can maybe get to some more questions. I'll probably leave it there, and I'd say yes. And I hope I'd love for tissue engineers to start seeing some of the work we're doing. So
Awesome. Yeah, there's definitely seems to be a pretty overlap, as you said, that CELAG seems to be a pretty good stepping stone for even further tissue engineering innovation in the future. So that's really cool to hear. The next question is, do you fund any research pertaining to environmental studies, industrial or climate impact studies, or any life cycle type analyses?
So the answer is yes and no. And I'll talk about why. So one of the seed grants we just funded was a master's student in a one-year program, and she is working on an LCA, or a life cycle analysis, or anticipatory life cycle analysis for us. And of course, one of the first papers New Harvest funded was Hannah Tuomisto's LCA, which got some critical feedback, is my way of saying it nicely. So we do have a precedent to fund that. And those are things that we do fund. The reason why I say no, and yes and no, is because I, as the research director, and I, as a member of New Harvest, so speaking on behalf of New Harvest, we do want to fund those projects. We just don't want to, or we want to do it right. And what I mean by that is, we want to make sure that people doing research that's not necessarily wet lab related can also be as equally supported as our fellows who are doing wet lab research. And we want to make sure that we have a good infrastructure set up for that. I would love to see more of that research, personally. I think the more fields we can bring in, the better, the more robust this field can be. I think our current goal for that, of course, anytime we say we're going to do something at a certain time, take that with a very big grain of salt. Just in general, I'd say. But our current idea is it's something that we're probably not going to find in this next cycle, which of course is coming up in January. But we're going to work to maybe look into funding more projects like that, perhaps in 2022, for instance. So that is an active area of research that I am currently investigating, if you will, for the research program. So definitely.
Nice. It sounds like there's going to be some cool projects coming in the future then in relation to those categories.
I certainly hope so.
Yeah, okay. So like the last four questions are more on the application process for the funding opportunities at New Harvest. So the first one is, are there any restrictions for international students when they apply?
As far as New Harvest is concerned, no. As far as universities are concerned, definitely. So, do check that. Another thing, depending on how you interpret international, because we have some US students who are technically international students because they're based in the UK. One thing I'd keep in mind is that sometimes when you're an international student, it can be a little more expensive because there may not be funding in your host country for you as a non-citizen. So that's always a caveat, I would say. But something that New Harvest does in the way we fund is, if your university is okay paying you, so if they've taken you on for like a J1 visa or something, we will give them money to pay you, if that makes any sense. So really it's about being copacetic with your university. We fund a student in New Zealand who's from Germany. So maybe then we're a US organization, so maybe I'll give you an idea of what we do. What's fun about being smaller is if you are a really good candidate and we do offer you a fellowship, we will work to try and make sure that works out for you. As I'm currently doing for one of our fellows. So that's something that I'd say certainly.
That's great to hear. There seems to be a lot of opportunities for everyone around the world. So that's awesome.
We try, yeah. Yes, we can.
So speaking about funding and the application, students have to provide a budget. What is expected in that budget? Is it supposed to be completely project centric, or can it also include things such as graduate student stipends?
Yeah, so to be quite honest, I see the end result of the application. I don't always know what goes into it. So all I can really do, I guess I could just ask. So maybe I will this next time I talk with some of our PIs. But when people submit a budget, and if you request the paperwork from me for an application, there's really three big categories that make up the budget. And one is your tuition, the other is your stipend, and the other is any laboratory fees that the university might ask of you. And so as I understand, the university will generally have standard numbers that they can give to you, and that's why we want you to apply with a PI, because they may have that information. But when it comes to stipend, this is something that will be rolled out, or if not rolled out, I would ask you to consider. And again, for any of these things, talk to me. But one thing that we are thinking of doing is encouraging people to apply with a budget of what they think will be an adequate support for them. So technically you're in control of proposing your stipend, in the sense that when you're preparing your budget, you're putting in the numbers physically for what it is. The university might have restrictions on that, something to definitely check out with your PI. I will say that our average is about $40,000 US for the whole thing, including stipend, lab fees, and tuition. People generally don't go over 55,000, and anything really above that is a bit more hard for us to fund and also fund other people. There is a range and there is some flexibility within it. So if you're interested in asking for more, if you're in a different situation, maybe you have a family to support and that kind of thing, definitely talk with us, us being New Harvest, and try and work out a good solution for that. That's what we want to try and do, at least. So.
Great, that's great to hear. So the next question is, does the eligibility round for the fellowship grant occur before or after the deadline?
Right. So technically after. And that was for several reasons. One being practical, in that there's only, I would say, a certain number I could look at specifically. So we introduced this eligibility round to kind of identify our top candidates. I will say that if you talk to me beforehand and I have a good sense that you understand what we're about, and you understand what's an in-scope project, and you've actively worked with New Harvest trying to identify what that is, there's a pretty good chance you'll pass the eligibility round, which I guess is a not subtle way of saying, please involve New Harvest in your application process, to the extent that it's possible. I think if we start getting 100 applications, it's going to be very hard for me to take all those calls. But right now, it's probably something that can be handled. So that is kind of my answer plus some, if that makes any sense. Certainly you're welcome to talk with me about your idea beforehand, or get in contact with New Harvest to talk about it, I should say. So yeah.
That's good to hear that New Harvest really wants to be involved with the application process and help students along. As a follow-up question, at what stage of this process would New Harvest like to see the PI start being in communication with with New Harvest?
So it's interesting because I get two kinds of calls. One is where a student comes in and their PI is on the call with me. It's always a little interesting. That is not 100% necessary. People can kind of come out of the woodwork at any time. When people generally request the information from New Harvest, they get a little list of things from me. And I say step 0 is finding a professor that you're willing to, who wants to work with you to do cell ag research, of course. And so I would say you can include the PI in conversations up to that point. I'd say certainly by the time we're being interviewed, we've talked with the PI. But generally, I encourage students to feel like this is something they can do on their own, if that makes any sense, to certainly talk with their PI to keep them informed of the process, to certainly work with them to put forth a proposal. But it's not strictly necessary to involve the PI before you apply. It's really up to your discretion, I would say. Definitely important to mention the things that I emphasize, that we ask, for a little bit of your time every week as a fellow, that we do encourage open access publishing. That we're definitely looking for more fundamental projects. I think those are the important things to emphasize to anyone you're working with. Some PIs will be receptive to that, some won't be, and that's a good thing for you as a student to be mindful of as well. So I guess the unhelpful answer is the best answer, which is it's really up to you, but definitely write a proposal with a PI. I can't say that enough. Yeah.
All right, that sounds great. And so the last question kind of goes off to what you're just touching there. Do you have any tips for persuading PIs to pursue cell ag research as a student interested in the field?
So that is a question that I've never had to answer before. And I'll admit that I've been really pleasantly surprised by the PIs that want to do work in this field. And that is something that I think has been true for like 95% of the cases in terms of the PIs that we work with. 95%, of course, being, my statistical uncertainty measurement there, if you will. Whatever my p-value is for that. But, in terms of persuading people, sometimes the PI has an interest in it. Sometimes the student has an interest in it. It's great when those two get together. If it's the case where you're very interested in it, and maybe your PI is a little bit hesitant to it, it's always important to remind them that there is funding for this research. The research does have a good, I would say, impact that's easy to justify for, maybe like a PI's impact statement sometimes when they're looking for funding. Let them know this is a new field that they can be involved with. But I'll admit that it's not always the easiest sell. And in fact, sometimes it's best for the PI to see it themselves. And it's something we're going to be working on, which is trying to get a little bit more PI testimony so that other PIs can be brought into this. But a good suggestion I would have is if they're hesitant, talk to me and maybe I can talk them into it. Maybe I can introduce them to some other PIs who do it. Glenn Gaudet at Worcester Polytech Institute got involved with cell ag from tissue engineering because he came to one of our conferences and saw the level of collaboration, and it really excited him as an individual. And that was what he craved in his professional life, and so he came into cell ag that way. I think that's accurate to say. You can correct me later if I'm wrong. But PIs generally respond well, in my experience, to enthusiasm and excitement, and of course, scientific rigor. And if that's something that you can bring forward in your conversation, that's what I would recommend. Remember that scientists are all problem solvers, and if I had a really good way to talk about the problem, that's often enticing enough for some people to at least listen. And that's kind of the first step. So that's what I would say towards that.
That's really good advice. I definitely agree. Enthusiasm is probably a great way to convince PIs, especially coming from a student perspective. So yeah, that's all the questions we had in our Q&A. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to pass it off real quick to Alexis so she can plug our next events from the Boulder Approaching Project.
Perfect.
thank you so much for such a great talk, and thank you everybody for coming today. I will share my screen real fast so we can see this. So just looking up into the future with the Boulder Out Protein Project, some upcoming events. Next week, next Thursday, we have our general body meeting for anybody interested. We're going to talk about any extra interest in the club or getting more involved, anything along those lines. November 12th, which is, I believe, the second Thursday of November, we have our journal club. We're reading The Eco-Friendly Burger by Dr. Han Tsumoto. So that will be run by Mia, or actually by Daniela next month. And then also into next month, first Thursday, we have Tyler Huggins coming in, and he is the CEO and co-founder of Meaty Foods. So thank you so much, everybody, for your time and
Thank
for
you.
being here with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, of course.